When Alex opened his eyes, he expected the familiar soft glow of morning sunlight leaking through the blinds of his bedroom. Maybe the faint hum of traffic, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, or the vibration of his phone with morning alerts. But instead, nothing. A heavy, chilling silence pressed in on him. The world around him was cloaked in an eerie gray mist, thick and still like a shroud. He blinked hard and sat up quickly, his heartbeat accelerating. The ground beneath him was damp and uneven, covered in mud, scattered twigs, and rotting leaves. Where his memory told him there should have been a mattress, there was only cold earth. Towering, moss covered trees stood all around, their limbs twisting overhead like skeletal arms blotting out the sky. But even the sky wasn't right. It was a dark, ash colored void, offering neither sun nor stars. Alex's breath misted in the air as he stood slowly. The air was freezing, and it reeked of wet soil, smoke, and something metallic, like blood or rust. A growing sense of dread wrapped itself around his spine. Where was he? He patted his pockets. His phone, gone. No jeans, no t-shirt. Instead, he wore a rough brown wool tunic that itched his skin, tied loosely at the waist with a frayed leather cord. His feet were wrapped in thin, muddy linen strips instead of shoes. It felt like waking up in a low-budget historical drama, except it was far too real. The cold bit at his fingers. The earth squelched beneath his steps. Every sound, or lack of it, was sharp and vivid. That was not a dream. Alex called out, "Hello, anyone?" His voice seemed to vanish into the fog. Not even an echo replied. Was he hallucinating? Drugged? Had something happened while he was asleep? His mind grasped at any modern explanation. A prank? A VR simulation gone wrong? Some kind of immersive LARP? But none of those made sense. The silence was too heavy, the cold too cutting, and the fear crawling up his throat was too real. Then faintly, voices. Low murmuring voices in the distance. He turned toward the sound, carefully stepping over roots and soggy patches of grass. As he crept forward, the voices grew clearer, but not familiar. He caught snippets of Latin, fragmented phrases like Deus miserere and Annus obscurus. Mixed with that were rougher, harsher syllables that might have been early Germanic dialects. It wasn't any version of German he'd ever heard. Peering through a break in the fog, he spotted a camp. A group of people huddled around, a dying fire in a shallow pit. There were no tents, just makeshift shelters made from tree branches, cloth, and debris. The people looked starved, hollowed out by exhaustion and hunger. Their skin was pale, their clothes filthy and torn. One child coughed violently, while his mother wrapped a threadbare shawl around his tiny frame. Another man with a crude wooden crutch limped to the fire, his eyes sunken and glassy. Alex hesitated, but hunger and confusion pushed him forward. As he approached cautiously, a few heads turned his way, their expressions a mix of wariness and resignation, like they had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. One man stepped forward, tall and lean, with a graying beard and a scar running down his cheek. He spoke in a thick accent, but his Latin was careful and deliberate. "You are lost, stranger." Alex nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. Yeah, I think I am." The man tilted his head, studying Alex's face and his tunic. "You are not from here. That much is clear." The man introduced himself as Earhart, a former merchant whose caravan had broken apart weeks ago. He led Alex to the fire and offered him a piece of stale bread. It was hard as stone, but Alex ate it gratefully. As they sat, Earhart explained. The year, he said, was 536, a cursed year. "The sun has not returned," he said grimly, staring into the smoke. "Since the spring, it remains hidden. A dull gray veil covers the sky. Crops rot. Animals die. Villages are buried in mud or flee to the woods. Some think the gods are angry. Others whisper of demons walking the earth. Alex's mind reeled. The year 536. That couldn't be right. He was a modern man, used to touch screens, Wi-Fi, Uber Eats. How could he be sitting here in the 6th century in a world on the brink of collapse? He remembered reading once about volcanic eruptions in history, about how a massive eruption could cause years without a summer. But that was in textbooks, not in real life. And even then, the specifics were vague. You said the sun hasn't come back. Not once, Alex asked. Earhart shook his head. A pale disk behind the clouds, if we're lucky, but no warmth. The rains come even in summer. Rivers flood. Grain is scarce. People starve. Kingdoms fracture. This is not a year for men to thrive. Alex looked around the camp, at the shivering children, the skeletal old man stirring something in a blackened pot, the desperate eyes of the survivors. It wasn't just a bad time. It was a collapse, a historical apocalypse. That night, Alex curled close to the fire, sharing a patch of dry ground with 2 other refugees who barely acknowledged him. The mist still hung in the air, thicker now, as though it wanted to smother them in their sleep. He couldn't stop trembling, not just from the cold, but from the weight of what he had heard. He had somehow slipped into the past, into one of the darkest periods of human history, a time before modern medicine, before electricity, before comfort. His mind whirled with questions. Was this permanent? A time anomaly? A punishment? A fluke of fate? He had no answers. Only the cold, the fog, and the terrible knowledge that survival here would be unlike anything he had ever known. And the most terrifying part? He might never get back. The days that followed were a blur of cold wind, hollow hunger, and haunting silence. Alex walked beside Earhart, the 2 moving cautiously through dense, damp forests and abandoned trails. The sky remained a smothered gray, its light filtered through layers of ash and cloud. Not once did the sun pierce the gloom. The world was cloaked in a sickly twilight, a colorless realm caught between day and night, life and death. Earhart led them toward what he claimed was an old Roman outpost nestled in the foothills of the Alps. There, perhaps, you will find answers, he had said, his voice grim. Or at the very least, not die in the mud like a rat. As they trudged on, Alex couldn't stop thinking about how surreal this all was. Only a week ago, or however long it had truly been, he'd been living a perfectly normal life. Coffee in the morning, emails, streaming shows. He'd never imagined he'd be shivering in a crumbling world, his stomach aching from hunger, his thoughts full of dread. The roads they followed were remnants of an ancient empire. Roman stones, once proud and solid, now lay cracked and scattered. Nature had reclaimed the once mighty paths, weeds growing between cobblestones, tree roots breaking through like the fingers of the earth itself. Occasionally, they passed wagons left to rot, their wooden frames eaten by time and dampness, a skeleton here or there, some human, some not, reminded Alex of the brutal reality of this era. By the 5th day, they reached the outskirts of what once had been a thriving Roman settlement. Now, it resembled more of a ruin than a town. Crumbling columns and broken statues lined the muddy entrance. A faded inscription read, Colonia Claudia Augusta, though the proud name had long lost its meaning. Inside, the scene was bleak. The village square was filled with gaunt citizens, their eyes sunken, skin pale, limbs trembling with exhaustion. Many wore robes patched together from scraps. Some simply lay on the ground, too weak to beg. Priests stood atop broken marble steps, chanting prayers and waving censers filled with smoking herbs. Their voices rose in Latin hymns, pleading for divine mercy. But there was no mercy in the skies, only falling ash drifting down like dirty snow. Alex brushed some from his shoulder. The fine gray particles clung to everything, to rooftops, to clothing, to skin. It was volcanic ash, he realized. His mind jumped to memories from his geology classes. A major eruption, likely somewhere in the far north, had thrown particles into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight across the northern hemisphere. It had to be one of the causes of this catastrophe, a disaster on a planetary scale. But these people didn't know about volcanism or atmospheric science. They believed the sun had been cursed, swallowed by angry gods, or banished for the sins of mankind. In the shadow of a ruined forum, Alex met Justina. She was sitting behind a makeshift stall, bottles of herbs and dried flowers spread across a worn cloth. She wore a cloak patched with fur and feathers, her dark hair braided back. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, the eyes of someone who had seen too much and refused to look away. She spoke Latin with precision, and a little Gothic, which Earhart helped translate when needed. When Alex hesitantly shared pieces of his story, expecting laughter or scorn, she surprised him. She did not call him insane. "I have read scrolls," she said thoughtfully, "of men who vanished and reappeared, of gods punished with exile, of stars falling, of time turning back on itself. You're not the strangest thing I've seen since the sun disappeared." It was the first time someone in this strange, broken world made Alex feel less alone. Justina was once a scribe, she told him, trained in Constantinople, but sent west with her family during the chaos of plague and invasion. When the skies turned dark and the famines began, she lost her brothers to hunger and her parents to sickness. She stayed behind, using her herbal knowledge to trade for food and protection. Alex and Justina quickly formed a partnership. She gave him a place to sleep, a corner of a ruined villa, partially sheltered from wind. In return, Alex helped her sort, label, and translate ancient scrolls. His knowledge of classical languages from university came back like muscle memory, and Justina was impressed. In the quiet hours of ash-filled afternoons, they would talk. Alex explained what little he could about the future, about volcanism, climate change, science. He told her that historians, centuries later, would name this time the late antique Little Ice Age. He spoke of a possible eruption in Iceland, one so powerful it dimmed the sun across the world, destroying crops and triggering pandemics. Justina listened, eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening around her herbal tools. "You speak of truths no one here will believe," she said softly. "People do not want reasons. They want someone to blame." She was right. One evening, as the sky turned a deeper gray and the wind howled like a wounded animal, a commotion broke out near the edge of the village. A woman had been accused of witchcraft. An old widow named Hilda, known for collecting rainwater and whispering strange prayers, was dragged through the streets by a mob. They screamed that she had cursed the sun, that her potions were poison, that her survival was proof of sorcery. Alex ran after the crowd, trying to shout reason to stop the madness, but his voice was drowned by rage and fear. They tied Hilda to a post, stacked broken wood around her, and lit the fire. Justina stood beside Alex, her face pale but unmoving. "This is what happens when the world loses light," she whispered. "People become monsters to survive." Alex watched the flames rise, unable to look away. The smoke twisted up into the ash-filled sky like a curse. The villagers around him cheered, cried, prayed, but no light returned. No warmth came, only more silence. That night, as the two sat near their weak fire inside the old villa, Alex couldn't sleep. The air tasted of soot and grief. He stared into the flickering flame and whispered, This isn't just a dark time. This is a time without hope. Justina said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Outside, the ash continued to fall. Spring arrived in name only. There were no blossoms, no birds returning from migration, no warming sun to coax life from the frozen ground. Instead, a bitter wind clawed across the landscape, and the air remained thick with ash and grief. Trees stood bare, their branches like broken fingers stretching toward a sky that never answered. It was spring only by the calendar. The earth had forgotten how to breathe. The crops didn't come. Farmers who had tilled the land for generations stared helplessly at barren fields. Seeds rotted in cold soil. The cattle, already thin from a fruitless winter, collapsed one by one. Mothers pressed their hands to the stomachs of their starving children, trying to will warmth and nourishment into bodies that had none left to give. Alex felt the desperation in his bones. He and Justina knew they couldn't stay in the collapsing outpost forever. Rumors traveled faster than any road. Ravenna, the seat of the Western Imperial Court, still had food, still had order, still had hope, or at least the illusion of it. So they joined a slow, desperate trickle of refugees heading south through a ruined world. Every mile was a graveyard. They passed wagons heaped with bodies, some covered in cloth, others bare in the cold. Entire villages had vanished, their homes stripped for firewood, their wells dry, their streets eerily silent. Occasionally they found scrawled warnings carved into wood. Plague here, do not enter. Whether the warnings were real or superstition hardly mattered. Fear was as deadly as famine. Along the way, Alex began to change. He wasn't just a lost man from the future anymore. He had no choice but to become part of this world. He found purpose and usefulness. With Justina's help and a few salvaged tools, he boiled spoiled wine into a rudimentary antiseptic. He remembered enough chemistry to separate lye from ashes and started crafting rough soap. He taught villages how to dig latrines far from their homes to prevent contamination of water sources. In a time where even a fever could kill, these little acts made a difference. Soon, whispers followed him. They called him the wizard of the northern forest, the stranger who knew the ways of hidden knowledge, who could purify wounds with sour drink, who spoke of tiny creatures too small to see that caused illness. Some came to him in reverence, bringing him cracked bowls of broth or crusts of bread. Others came with suspicion, staring with narrowed eyes, crossing themselves, whispering that he consorted with demons. But Alex kept moving forward. He had to. The hunger was always at his back. When they finally reached Ravenna, they found not salvation, but chaos in a gilded frame. The great city still stood, surrounded by marshes and high walls. Golden mosaics glittered in places, remnants of a more glorious time. But within the walls, it was no paradise. The streets were filled with people, hundreds, maybe thousands, all clamoring for food, shelter, medicine. The Byzantine governor, thin and sickly himself, sat behind guarded gates, trying in vain to maintain order. His storehouses were nearly empty. His soldiers were tired, their hands quick to draw steel. Alex saw it happen on the third day. A food cart rolled into the main square, escorted by armored guards. The crowd surged, hands reached out, cries filled the air. Someone shouted that the food was being hoarded. Then a rock flew, then another. The guards panicked. Swords flashed. Blood sprayed to the cobblestones. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, was knocked to the ground in the stampede. Alex rushed forward, but it was too late. The boy lay crushed beneath the boot prints, his tiny fingers curled, as if still reaching for bread. That night, Alex sat with Justina in a ruined church. his head in his hands. This world is tearing itself apart, he said quietly. There's nothing left to hold it together. Justina looked at him, her eyes steady but tired. This is what the end of the world feels like. But even as despair pressed in, something inside Alex refused to give up. He couldn't change the skies. He couldn't bring back the sun. But he had knowledge, and knowledge, even in fragments, was fire in the dark. He scavenged parchment, ink, and quills from abandoned temples and shuttered schools. Every night by candlelight he wrote. He wrote feverishly, page after page. Diagrams of crop rotations, instructions for sterilizing water, notes on hygiene, records of medicinal herbs, summaries of Roman engineering, even basic mathematics. He didn't know who would read them, or if they would survive the coming decades. But if even a single idea could take root, then maybe, just maybe, the world wouldn't have to start from nothing again. Justina helped him organize the scrolls. She transcribed in neat Latin and added her own observations from herbal work. Together they created something rare in this time of ruin, the beginnings of a seed library for human survival. But the darkness wasn't finished with Ravenna. One night, it came in flame. The fire started in the slums, maybe from a spark, maybe from revenge. No one ever knew. But soon, the night sky lit up with a fierce orange glow, and the choking scent of smoke overpowered even the ash. Buildings collapsed in on themselves. Roofs blazed like torches. People screamed through narrow alleys, clutching children, dragging possessions, or just running without direction. Alex ran too, not to escape, but toward the screams. He found a little girl no older than 4, alone and crying near a burning stable. Her face was covered in soot, her eyes wide with terror. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. She clung to him desperately, her thin arms like ropes around his neck. He carried her through the chaos, through the smoke and cinders, until they reached the edge of the city. Justina met them near the marsh path, coughing from the fumes. Together they wrapped the child in a cloak and gave her water. Later, as they sat outside the burning city, watching the flames consume the fragile hope of Ravenna, Alex looked at the sleeping child beside him and felt something shift in his soul. "I'm not giving up," he whispered. "Not for me, for her, for all of them." That night, beneath a sky darker than ever before, Alex made a vow, not just to survive, but to be a light in this endless night, a bearer of knowledge, a protector of innocence, a builder of a future he might never see. Even if the world had forgotten how to hope, he hadn't. By the spring of 537, famine had carved deep scars into the land, but what came next made starvation feel like mercy. It began with whispers. Dock workers in Ravenna muttering about fevered men arriving from Alexandria. Sailors collapsing in the harbors of Constantinople. Merchants warning of entire ships abandoned at sea, their cargo untouched, their crews dead. The Eastern Mediterranean, once the empire's lifeblood, now delivered only death. The sickness arrived silently, like a shadow crawling ashore. Justina noticed it first. A boy brought to her with a swollen lump beneath his jaw, burning with fever. His skin turned a mottled gray by morning, and by evening he was gone. Then came a woman with blackened fingertips, a merchant who bled from his gums, a priest who collapsed mid-sermon, choking on his own breath. Alex recognized it with a cold jolt of horror. The plague of Justinian, one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. In his world, it had been just a chapter in a history book. Now he was living it. "This is it," he told Justina, staring at the second corpse they buried that week. "The beginning of it all, the bubonic plague." Justina paled, but her resolve didn't waver. "Then we fight it." Together they fought as best they could. Alex, drawing on every scrap of scientific memory he could muster, began improvising protocols. He boiled herbs in water and soaked rags in the bitter broth, crafting crude face coverings that reeked of thyme, mint, and vinegar. He taught villagers to avoid crowds, to boil water, to burn the bedding of the infected. Corpses, once left in the streets, were buried deep in hastily dug trenches. He begged the local officials, what little remained of Ravenna's broken administration, to quarantine the sick, to block ships from docking without inspection. But bureaucracy in a dying world was slower than disease. No one wanted to believe the full scale of what was coming. Some priests insisted it was divine punishment and forbade burning the bodies. Others encouraged mass gatherings to pray for deliverance, and in doing so, helped spread the disease further. The plague moved faster than reason. Within weeks, entire quarters of Ravenna were wiped out. The alleyways stank of death. Rats scurried freely through markets, emboldened by the silence. Bells rang out not to mark hours, but to signal the passing of another soul. Priests, overwhelmed and exhausted, gathered in groups to offer last rites by the dozen, their voices hoarse from reciting prayers too often. No one had enough cloth to wrap all the dead. They stacked them in rows, then in piles, until the very ground seemed to sag beneath the weight of bodies. Then came the night when Justina collapsed. She'd been treating the sick for days, refusing rest, her fingers cracked and stained with the blood of strangers. Alex had warned her, begged her to sleep, to eat, to protect herself, but her sense of duty had outweighed her fear, until her body gave in. He found her in their shelter, slumped over her herbal basket, her breathing ragged. "No," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "No, not you." She was burning with fever, her skin glistening with sweat, her breath shallow. A dark swelling had formed on her neck, the unmistakable sign. Alex's hands shook as he pulled together everything he had. Cloth soaked in vinegar, crushed garlic, a tea of elderflower and yarrow. He remembered old studies, fragments of medieval texts, desperate methods. Nothing was certain. But he tried everything. For 3 days, he barely slept. He spooned water between her lips. He cooled her forehead with damp cloths. He whispered stories from the future to keep her mind tethered. Tales of skyscrapers, of flying machines, of music carried through wires, of medicine that could kill infection in a single dose. "You'd love it," he told her softly one night, watching her chest rise and fall in uneven rhythm. "The world I came from, it's messy, but there's hope there. Real hope." On the 4th day, her fever broke. Weak and pale, Justina opened her eyes and whispered, "Still here?" He laughed, tears slipping down his face. "Always." But the world outside had grown even darker. The survivors in Ravenna had become feral with grief and fear. Rumors spread of witches, of divine wrath, of unnatural men. And at the center of the suspicion was Alex. He had not fallen ill. He spoke strange words. He wore a mask no one else understood. He knew too much. Some said he had summoned the plague. Others said he had brought it with him. One night, as the plague winds howled through the alleys, a group of townspeople gathered outside their shelter. They carried torches. One man shouted that the stranger had cursed the city. Another cried for justice. Alex could see it in their eyes, the same fear he had seen when they burned the widow, the same fear that fed on ignorance and bred violence. He grabbed their few belongings, a satchel of dried herbs, their remaining scrolls, and Justina's medicine pouch, and shook her gently. "We have to go. Now." Justina, still weak, nodded. Leaning on him, they slipped out through the back entrance and vanished into the night. They fled into the black forest once more, beneath a sky that seemed to hold no stars. The trees were wet with dew and ash. The forest air, though thick with cold, felt cleaner than the plague-choked city they left behind. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. Or maybe it was something else. But they kept moving, deeper and deeper, until the sounds of Ravenna and its horrors faded behind them. They made camp near an ancient stone ruin, half buried by moss and time. There, beside a dying fire, Alex opened one of his scrolls and began to write again. Justina, curled under a cloak beside him, asked weakly, "Why do you keep writing?" Alex stared at the parchment. His hands were raw, ink-stained. His eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion. But his voice was steady. "Because the world will end," he said. "But maybe it doesn't have to end forever." He didn't know who would find these words. He didn't know if he or Justina would survive the year, or the next plague wave, or the slow collapse of civilization. But he knew this: memory mattered, and hope, even in the age of darkness, could still be written down. Months passed in exile, measured not by calendars, but by the creaking of trees under snow and the rhythm of hunger in their bellies. For Alex and Justina, survival became ritual. Find warmth, ration herbs, hide from suspicion. The forest was both shield and prison, its silence a constant reminder of how far from civilization they had fallen. Then, as if conjured from myth, salvation appeared in the form of a stone monastery nestled high in the Apennine Mountains. The monastery was a place out of time. Its walls, made of thick stone and crowned with snow, stood as if carved from the mountain itself. The monks who lived there were a quiet order, tending goats and vegetables, bound by their vows to silence and simplicity. They rarely spoke, even to each other, but their eyes were full of ancient knowing. When Alex and Justina arrived at the gates, half frozen and exhausted, the monks hesitated only a moment before taking them in. Inside, warmth waited. Bowls of lentil stew, rough blankets, and a stone hearth that glowed like a secret heart in the cold, dark chapel. The monks didn't ask questions. They simply gave, and in that giving, offered Alex something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. In return, Alex gave knowledge. He began with simple things: crop rotation techniques to keep the soil fertile, composting methods, herbal remedies beyond what even Justina knew. Soon he was showing them how to extract oils, create soap, and even how to trap heat with better chimney designs. He drew diagrams for primitive greenhouses using animal skins and glass. He taught them how to build sand filters for water and how to keep records more efficiently with ink he helped them make from soot, wine dregs, and iron salts. The monks never stopped him. They watched, listened, and wrote. One monk in particular, a pale, sharp-eyed man named Brother Laurentius, became his shadow. He broke his vow of silence after 2 weeks. "These things you teach," he said one night, poring over a scroll Alex had written, "they are not magic, but truth?" Alex nodded, weary but calm. "They're knowledge, from a place far away, a time far ahead." Laurentius said nothing more that night, but from then on, he worked beside Alex every evening, copying scrolls and translating them into precise Latin. He showed Alex how to seal the parchments in beeswax-lined jars, wrapping them with linen soaked in resin to preserve them from damp. Together they buried the jars beneath the chapel floor, between the bones of forgotten saints and the flickering shadows of candlelight. Alex didn't know if they would be found in 10 years or 1,000, but that no longer mattered. He had done what he could, still his body was failing. He was thinner now, pale and worn. The cold winters of the Apennines, the constant stress, the lack of proper nutrition, it was too much. His hands trembled when he wrote. His legs ached when he walked. Justina noticed first but said nothing. She only started brewing stronger teas, pressing warm stones against his chest as he slept. Then came the morning when he didn't wake. Justina found him lying beneath the chapel stairs, his skin ice cold, his breath shallow. She shouted, breaking the silence of the monastery for the first time in years. Monks gathered as she wept over his body, pressing herbs to his chest, whispering old prayers between modern instructions. For 3 days, Alex drifted between worlds. He was too weak to move, too fevered to speak. He dreamed of fire and ash, of silent monks and burning cities, of flying machines and green fields. Then, a strange thing. He woke, not to the bitter wind or stony walls of the monastery, but to the gentle hum of machines. His eyes fluttered open, white ceilings, blinking monitors, the steady beep of a heart rate monitor pulsing beside him. A soft voice. "You're awake," a nurse said, leaning over him. Her scrubs were blue, her eyes kind. "You've been in a coma for a week. You're safe now." Alex blinked, stunned. His lips cracked as he forced out the words. What? What year is it?" She smiled, brushing hair from his forehead. 2025. A rush of disbelief, of confusion and relief surged through him. He was home, somehow. Whether by miracle, fate, or the brain's final illusion, he had returned. The doctors would later tell him he'd been found half frozen on a mountain trail in Italy. They believed he'd slipped into a crevice while hiking and gone into hypothermic shock. His body had shut down, and for 7 days, he had lingered in a coma. "No one could survive what you did," one doctor said. "You're lucky." But Alex didn't feel lucky. He felt changed, and yet no one believed his story. They called it a dream, a hallucination caused by cold and trauma. Even Justina, the monks, the plague, all dismissed as the fevered creation of a dying brain. Except, in the months that followed, as Alex recovered, he found himself drawn to libraries and archives, chasing shadows in the margins of history. He combed through obscure monastic texts, forgotten footnotes, and museum archives, buried in digital catalogs. Then, one rainy afternoon, he found it, an obscure reference in a catalog of medieval Latin writings, a scroll fragment recovered from a monastery ruin in central Italy. It mentioned a visitor from a far-off age, a stranger who came during the Great Darkness, who taught of fire, disease, and light, who spoke of carts that flew and lamps that glowed without flame. They had called him Alessio lo Straniero. Alex stared at the parchment image on the screen. The script was Laurentius's hand. He would have recognized it anywhere. His throat tightened. It was real. All of it. The monastery, the plague, Justina. He had lived it, and in that moment, sitting in a modern library under electric lights, Alex smiled. He had crossed centuries, survived history's darkest year, and returned. And more than that, he had left something behind. A flicker in the dark. A seed of light planted in a world that had forgotten what light was. Perhaps he would never know how much of it endured, but he had written. He had taught. He had tried. And sometimes that was enough. Jacob Foster had no idea how it happened. One moment, he was walking home from the university library in 2025, earbuds in, halfway through a podcast episode titled World at War, the Psalm, and the Shattered Century. The streets of Cambridge were quiet, the leaves crunching under his sneakers, the autumn air brisk and pleasant. He was thinking about his thesis, something about propaganda posters and the shaping of public morale in early 20th century Europe, when everything around him simply vanished. No warning, no noise, no sensation of falling, just blackness, then cold. He awoke surrounded by heavy fog, so thick it pressed against his skin like damp wool. His breath came out in quick, visible bursts. The air smelled wrong, a mix of rotting earth, coal smoke, and something sharp and metallic that burned the back of his throat. He staggered forward, boots crunching not on pavement but on mud. Thick, wet mud. His foot sank deep, and he almost fell. His clothes were wrong. Gone was his hoodie and jeans. In their place, thick, coarse wool, a drab olive tunic, and puttees tightly wound around his legs. His hands were rough, calloused, with fingernails blackened by grime. Something heavy pressed on his head, a helmet, and then he heard it, the distant dull boom of artillery. Not thunder, not fireworks, something deeper, heavier, real. Jacob's heart pounded. He spun around wildly, looking for anything familiar, a street sign, a building, a car, but there was nothing but the thick fog and indistinct shapes beyond. The sky was a blank smear of gray. Then a whistle, a sharp, shrill call, followed by the shouted chaos of foreign tongues. French? Maybe German? He ducked instinctively as something screamed overhead. A shell. It exploded somewhere to his left, shaking the ground. Clods of dirt and ash rained down. Jacob stumbled forward, then slid into a trench. It was like nothing he'd ever seen, and yet it looked exactly like the photos in his textbooks. Narrow, dug deep into the mud, with sandbags piled high on either side, and wooden planks covering parts of the floor. The trench twisted and turned like a maze. Soldiers, dozens of them, pressed against the walls, mud covering their faces and uniforms. Some smoked, others prayed. All looked exhausted, their eyes hollow. Before he could ask anything, a strong hand grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. "You deaf, mate? On your feet. Orders just came down. We go over in 5. The man speaking had a thick Cockney accent, his face smeared with dirt and stubble. His uniform was as filthy as Jacob's, but his movements were practiced, confident. "I what?" Jacob managed to stammer. "Don't start cracking now," the man said, adjusting Jacob's gear like he'd done it 100 times. "First time's always the worst, but keep your boots dry and your head lower than your pride. Might see tomorrow." He gave a grim smile and extended a hand. "Ellis, Private Tom Ellis." Jacob shook it automatically. "Jacob, I think I hit my head." "No time for that. You'll have plenty of time to forget your name after this push." Ellis handed him a Lee Enfield rifle. It was heavier than Jacob expected, solid wood and steel. The weight felt unreal in his hands. Then the orders came again, shouted down the line. "Fix bayonets." With numb fingers, Jacob watched Ellis slide the long blade onto the muzzle of his rifle. He copied the motion, though his hands trembled. Around them, men were checking equipment, adjusting helmets, muttering prayers under their breath. One kissed a small photograph and tucked it into his breast pocket. Jacob's brain screamed that this wasn't possible. It was insane. He had to be dreaming, or in a coma, or dead. But the pain in his hands, from gripping the rifle too tight, the sting of mud in his eyes, the stink of sweat and cordite, it was all too real. "This your first?" Ellis asked again, his tone quieter now. Jacob nodded slowly, almost ashamed. Ellis didn't laugh. "Then don't try to be a hero. Run fast, shoot straight, and if the bloke next to you drops, keep moving. That's all we can do." A moment of silence passed between them, heavy and meaningful. Then the whistle blew. A shriek that cut through fog, fear, and thought. With a groan, the line began to move. One by one, men climbed the wooden ladders, leaning against the trench wall. Mud-slicked boots gripped the rungs, rifles slung tight. Some muttered prayers, others shouted to drown the fear. One man sobbed openly as he climbed. Jacob followed Ellis up the ladder. The world exploded. The surface was hell. A gray, blasted expanse stretched before them. Craters, barbed wire, scorched earth, broken trees like skeletal fingers. The sky was thick with smoke and screaming metal. Shells burst in distant flashes. Machine guns rattled like thunder from beyond the haze. No man's land. Jacob ran forward because everyone else was running, because not running would mean being trampled or shot. His boots splashed through muck. The air stung his lungs. Bullets zipped past, hissing like angry insects. Someone screamed nearby. A man dropped beside him, clutching his stomach. Blood soaked the dirt. Jacob's breath caught, but he kept running. Ellis shouted something, but it was lost in the roar of war. A shell detonated ahead, showering them with debris. Jacob ducked instinctively, his heart pounding so hard he could barely think. The weight of the rifle in his hands was suddenly everything, his anchor, his shield, his only chance. He didn't know where the enemy was. He didn't know what the orders were. He only knew that if he stopped, he would die. All he could do was run, duck, crawl, and pray. He had landed, somehow impossibly, terrifyingly, in the middle of the First World War. And there was no way back. The moment Jacob's boots left the trench and sank into the mire of no man's land, he understood just how thin the line between life and death really was. There was no time to think, only to react. Mud clung to his feet like it wanted to drag him under, like the very earth resented their presence. He stumbled with every step, and the moment he regained his footing, the scream of a mortar filled the sky. Then the explosion. A plume of dirt and flame swallowed 2 men ahead of him. Screams followed. One didn't rise. The other crawled, legs twisted unnaturally, wailing like a child. Jacob wanted to stop. He wanted to help. But another soldier, a sergeant maybe, grabbed his collar and shoved him forward. "Move! You stop! You die!" So he ran, blindly, through wire and mud and smoke, past the bodies of men he didn't know, through a battlefield stitched together by madness and fire. He ducked when the others ducked, threw himself into shell craters when others dropped. He didn't think, he followed. Instinct ruled everything now. He finally landed behind the broken remains of a splintered tree trunk, more charcoal than wood. He dropped to his knees, gasping for air. His lungs burned with a toxic mix of smoke and fear. The heavy wool uniform clung to his skin, soaked in sweat, mud, and something he couldn't identify. His heart hammered in his chest like it was trying to escape. The rifle in his hands felt alien, useless. A lump of metal and wood meant for a soldier, not a student. He hadn't even fired it, didn't know if he could. Next to him, Ellis dropped down with practiced ease, hitting the ground and leveling his rifle toward the haze. He was calm, too calm as he scanned the line. His fingers moved fast, reloading with muscle memory. Shells exploded around them, but his eyes didn't blink. "They'll push soon," Ellis muttered. "Germans don't hold quiet for long." Jacob barely heard him. His ears rang. He forced his gaze toward Ellis, and, through the haze of panic, croaked, What year is it?" Ellis glanced at him, confused. "You joking?" "No, please, just say it." Ellis frowned, adjusting his helmet. 1917. April, I think. Why? Jacob's stomach twisted violently. 1917. The worst of it. The Western Front. He was somewhere between Ypres and the Somme, maybe even Arras, and that meant carnage. Trenches, mustard gas, mud and death. Millions dead. Millions more broken. He leaned back against the blackened stump, trembling. His fingers dug into the mud just to feel something solid. His mind screamed for reason, for logic, for escape. But this was real. The ache in his legs, the stench in the air, the dull pain in his shoulder where the rifle strap bit into his flesh. It was all real. Why me? He whispered. It wasn't a question for Ellis. It was for the universe, or God, or whatever force had thrown him into the bloodiest war in modern history. Ellis didn't answer. Instead, he reached into a satchel and tossed Jacob a small tin. Eat fast, could be your last meal. Inside were dry biscuits, hard and tasteless. But Jacob bit down anyway. He hadn't realized how hungry he was, or how tired. His hands trembled as he ate. His body was on the edge of collapse. More shells screamed overhead. The explosions came closer this time. Dirt sprayed over them. A body tumbled into a crater just a few feet away. He didn't look. What the hell are we even doing here? Jacob said after swallowing. What's the objective? Ellis gave a short, bitter laugh. Objective? Live till sunset, that's all. I mean the war. All of this. Ellis glanced at him. God, you did hit your head. Jacob sighed and leaned his head back, staring up into the gray sky. His mind flashed with dates, maps, political events. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the tangle of alliances, the Battle of the Somme, Verdun. Millions dead over inches of ground, and now he was part of it. He wasn't a reenactor, he wasn't dreaming, he was here. We shouldn't even be out here. Ellis added quietly, suddenly serious. We gained 50 yards yesterday, cost us 70 men. Those yards will be gone again by morning. He spat into the mud. Not that it matters. A whistle blew far behind them. One short blast. Ellis's body tensed. Get ready, he muttered. Jacob clutched his rifle tighter, although his hands were still shaking. He peeked over the low edge of their cover and saw movement in the mist. Shadows. Figures. German helmets. Rifles raised. Here they come, someone shouted down the line. A symphony of gunfire erupted. British rifles cracked in rapid succession. Machine guns rattled in violent bursts. Jacob froze. His heart screamed for him to move, to shoot, to do something, but his body refused. Ellis yelled, "Fire, damn it!" Jacob pulled the trigger. The recoil surprised him. He didn't even know if he hit anything. He chambered another round and fired again. And again. He ducked low as a bullet zipped past his helmet, clipping the edge of the tree stump. He fired a fourth time, not even aiming anymore, just shooting to survive. Bodies fell. Some cried out. Others didn't move. German soldiers dropped into craters or sprawled across the wire. Ellis shouted for Jacob to move left, covering a breach in the line. Jacob scrambled into a new position, heart thundering. And for the first time since arriving here, he wasn't thinking. He was just acting. Something inside him hardened. By the time the counterattack slowed, Jacob's hands were numb, and the rifle was hot from use. The air was filled with smoke and the smell of blood. Medics moved through the line, dragging wounded men back behind cover. Jacob sat with his back against the dirt wall, panting. Ellis leaned beside him, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. Didn't run, that's something. Jacob looked at him. I don't think I can do this. Ellis exhaled. None of us can, that's the point. We just keep doing it anyway. Jacob closed his eyes, the sounds of the battlefield still ringing in his ears. He had survived his first day in no man's land, but the war, this war, had only just begun. When Jacob awoke, he wasn't sure where he was, only that it was quiet, too quiet, and his chest throbbed with pain. The trench was gone. The explosions were gone. Instead, there were murmurs, moans, the faint rustle of fabric, the soft clink of metal trays. He blinked up at a pale canvas ceiling lit by flickering lanterns. Shadows danced across the fabric walls. His skin was cold, damp with sweat, and his chest was tightly wrapped with bandages. A nurse hovered over him, her hands pressing gently against his side. She was young, with soot-smudged cheeks, red-rimmed eyes, and a weariness carved deep into her face. Her uniform, blue with a white apron, was stained, but her hands were steady. Shrapnel just below the ribs. "You're lucky," she said softly. "A few inches higher and—" She didn't finish. Jacob tried to speak, but coughed instead, wincing as his chest flared with pain. "Don't try too hard," she said, helping him sip water from a tin cup. "You've been unconscious for hours." He looked around, dazed. The field hospital was nothing more than a large canvas tent with rows of cots. Some were empty, most were not. The wounded lay still, groaning, crying out in fevered whispers. The air was thick with the scent of iodine, sweat, and blood. Somewhere nearby, a man screamed for his mother, his voice high and broken. The nurse smoothed his blanket. "I'm Margaret," she said gently. "Try to rest." He managed a nod before drifting back into the darkness. Over the next few days, Jacob drifted in and out of consciousness. Pain anchored him to the present, but dreams, vivid, terrifying dreams, kept trying to pull him back to the trench, to the blast that had thrown him into the mud. He remembered the heat, the noise, the taste of dirt and blood. And then nothing. Now, in the hospital, time felt strange. The world outside moved on without him. Nurses moved between cots like ghosts, administering morphine, checking bandages, muttering prayers under their breath. Doctors barked orders. The wounded came and went, some left on stretchers, others never moved again. On the third night, Margaret returned. "You're lucky," she repeated, sitting beside him with a basin of water. "3 others came in with the same wound. Only you made it." He nodded slowly, watching her wring out a cloth. "Thank you for all of this." She smiled faintly. "It's not kindness, Mr. Foster, it's duty." He studied her as she worked, gently removing his old bandages and cleaning the wound. Her hands were skilled, precise, but he could see the fatigue behind her eyes, the weight of too many deaths. "You're British," she said after a moment, "but your speech is strange." Jacob hesitated. "I'm from far away." Margaret didn't press him. She only nodded, as if she'd heard stranger things. The hospital became its own kind of battlefield. There were no bullets here, but the war raged on. Against infection, against fever, against time. Men arrived in waves, covered in mud and blood, many too broken to speak. Some cried, some stared into the distance as if already dead. Others raged, cursing at doctors, begging for morphine. One man clawed at his own bandages in a fit of delirium, screaming that rats were crawling beneath his skin. Jacob tried not to look, but he couldn't look away. One morning, he awoke to find the cot beside him empty. The man who had slept there, a boy barely old enough to shave, had died in the night. Jacob hadn't even learned his name. The staff worked constantly. Margaret moved without pause, always with purpose, adjusting bandages, comforting the dying, scribbling in patient logs. Her strength humbled Jacob. She never complained, never cried, she only moved. And slowly Jacob began to move too. At first he helped with small things, passing water cups, straightening blankets. But as his strength returned, he took on more. He wrote letters for the injured, his pen steady even when the words were not. "Tell my wife I didn't suffer," one man said, before slipping into unconsciousness. Another asked him to write to his mother, to lie, to say he would come home soon. Jacob wrote every word, sealing it with trembling hands. Margaret noticed. "You're good at this," she said quietly one evening, watching him fold a letter. "You care. I'm not supposed to be here," he replied. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "No one is." "I don't belong here," he said again, softer this time. She sat beside him. "You say you're from far away. Maybe you were meant to see this, to remember it, to tell the truth of it." Jacob turned toward her. What truth? That it wasn't glory. It wasn't heroism. It was this. She gestured around them. Mud. Screaming. Silence. This is the war most people never see. He didn't know what to say, but the words lingered. By the end of the week, Jacob was walking again, albeit slowly. The doctor declared him fit enough to be transferred back to a logistics post behind the front. It would be safer there, relatively. Margaret packed his things in a small satchel and handed him a folded slip of paper. "What's this?" he asked. She shrugged. "Just a letter, in case you forget." He unfolded it once he was outside the tent. The ink was neat, hurried, but elegant. "You saw things others didn't. That means you carry it for them. Whatever you were before, you're something else now. If you make it home, remember us." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Jacob stood there in the early morning fog, the cold biting through his tunic, and understood something vital. Survival was only the beginning. Remembering, truly remembering, was the burden he now carried. Because in the trenches and the hospitals, in the silence between shell fire and sobbing, were stories, real people, real suffering. And if he could not change history, maybe he could honor it. By late spring of 1917, Jacob had been reassigned. His wound had healed, but his soul had not. Something in him had hardened, grown quieter, more observant. He had seen too much, heard too much. Now, instead of fighting on the front lines, he carried information. Vital dispatches passed between command posts, along the trenches, and forward outposts. He had become a runner. It was still dangerous, just a different kind of suicide. He was fast, good with directions, and learned to read maps with precision. And most of all, he didn't ask questions. Runners needed strong legs and sharper instincts. Orders came quickly, and they moved quicker. Through mud, mortar fire, and fields riddled with barbed wire, they raced between what was left of sanity and command. Jacob knew why they picked him. He wasn't a killer, but he could carry words, and that made him useful. One gray morning, heavy fog blanketed the landscape. It was thick enough to choke on, the kind that wrapped around your body like a shroud and made sound behave strangely. Echoes came from the wrong direction, shouts vanished into nothing. Jacob was given a sealed message and ordered to deliver it to an isolated outpost near the edge of the Ypres sector. They gave him a horse, a rare luxury and a fast one, and told him to ride hard and not stop. He did, but halfway there, the ground shook. Jacob barely had time to hear the distant whistle of incoming shells before the earth exploded beneath him. His horse reared, then crumpled, sending him flying. He hit the ground hard. Everything went black. He woke up hours later, his head throbbing and his ribs aching. When he blinked open his eyes, the fog had lifted slightly, but only enough for him to see the circle of soldiers standing around him. Rifles pointed, helmets unlike the ones worn by his comrades. The uniforms were field gray. German, they shouted commands at him. Rough words, sharp voices. British? One asked in halting English. Jacob slowly raised his hands. Yes, he whispered, his throat dry and sore. For a moment he thought he'd be shot right there in the mud. One twitch of a finger, one mistaken word, but the man with the rifle didn't pull the trigger. Instead, a younger officer stepped forward, neat and proper, with a monocle perched over one eye, and a strange calm in his face. "You're lucky," he said in a clipped accent. "We usually don't take prisoners this far forward." Then he gestured to the others. "Bind his hands. He comes with us." Jacob didn't resist. There was no point. The German camp wasn't far. A series of dugouts and tents hidden deep in a crater-ridden forest just behind their lines. Jacob was tossed onto a cot and checked for weapons, but they left him otherwise untouched. He braced himself for the worst. Interrogation. beatings, humiliation. But what followed was something stranger, something worse. Kindness. They gave him water. Bread, hard and dry, but food nonetheless. A medic patched the cuts on his forehead and wrapped his swollen ankle. No one yelled. No one beat him. They barely spoke to him at all. At night, he was locked in a small shed behind the medical tent, but during the day, he was allowed to sit near the fire, watched always, but not mistreated. There, he met Friedrich. The German was in his late 20s, clean-shaven but clearly tired. He wore his uniform neatly but without pride. His hands were covered in ink stains. He noticed Jacob shivering near the fire and tossed him an extra blanket without a word. Later, using slow, careful German and broken English, they began to talk. "You're a runner?" Friedrich asked. Jacob nodded. "Was." Friedrich nodded too. "I was a student. Munich. Engineering." The statement hit Jacob harder than he expected. Friedrich could have been someone he passed in a lecture hall, someone who might have helped him study for finals, someone who might have argued about politics or shared a coffee on a campus lawn. "We don't want this war," Friedrich said one evening, when the bombs had gone quiet for a rare few hours. "Not me, not my friends. We just want it to end." Jacob looked into the fire. "So do we." There was silence after that, but a kind of understanding settled between them, deeper than politics, deeper than uniforms. They were both just men, out of place in a world that had turned mad. On the fourth night, the sky erupted again. British bombers. Shells rained down on the outskirts of the camp. Screams rose as tents were torn apart by explosions. Lights flickered. Smoke filled the air. Confusion reigned. Jacob didn't think, he acted. He tore the door off his shed and ran into the darkness. No one stopped him. Either they didn't see him or they didn't care anymore. Bodies rushed past in every direction. Cries for medics. Shouts in German. Fire. Ash. In the chaos, he slipped into the trees, heading away from the light, from the noise, deeper into the dark woods, toward whatever direction felt like freedom. But he hesitated once, just once. He reached into his coat and pulled out the compass Friedrich had given him earlier that day. "A gift," Friedrich had said, "for when you go home, if you do." Jacob clutched it now, the metal warm from his body heat. The arrow trembled northward. He didn't look back. By dawn, Jacob had crossed no man's land, under the cover of mist and ruin. He stumbled into a British trench, covered in mud and blood. The sentries raised their rifles until they recognized the uniform and the exhaustion in his eyes. They pulled him in. A medic cleaned him up again. A captain debriefed him, and then they sent him to rest. Jacob collapsed into a bunk and stared at the ceiling. The compass sat in his hand, gleaming faintly in the morning light. He hadn't been tortured. He hadn't been broken. Instead, he'd seen something more haunting: humanity. In that German camp, he'd come face to face with men who were supposed to be monsters. Instead, he found students, fathers, sons, engineers who wanted to build bridges, not burn them, soldiers who gave him bread, not bullets. This war had no winners, only survivors, only scars. Jacob knew now he couldn't stop the war, but he could carry its truth, and maybe one day he'd return to a world that listened. The days grew shorter. The light faded sooner, and the cold began to seep into Jacob's bones the way sorrow had long ago seeped into his soul. It was late 1917 when winter's grip began to tighten around the front. The air grew sharper, and the mud froze solid beneath boots that had marched too far for too long. Jacob, once a stunned outsider, now moved with the quiet fatigue of someone who had seen too much. His shoulders hunched. His eyes stayed distant. He spoke less, but he wrote more. In every spare moment, he scribbled notes in a leather-bound journal, accounts of battles, conversations, human moments between destruction. Sometimes he recorded names, faces, words said before death. Other times, he simply wrote the truth. That war was suffering, slow and choking, not glory wrapped in banners. The journal never left his side. By early 1918, something began to shift. Whispers moved along the trenches faster than bullets. German soldiers were exhausted. Supplies were thin. Desertions were rising. Some units refused to fight. Others turned on their own commanders. Jacob overheard two officers speaking in hushed tones. "There's unrest in Berlin. Revolution." And then came the word, armistice. It was said quietly at first, like a spell no one dared speak too loudly in case it broke. But once it took hold, it spread like fire. Men who had forgotten how to hope began to lift their heads again. There were no cheers, not yet, only questions. When? Is it real? Can it be true? Jacob felt it too, the strange weight of something ending. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. The war that had rewritten his life might finally be drawing to a close. Then came the moment. It was an ordinary morning, colder than usual. The sky was low and gray. Jacob had been walking along a forest trail a few miles behind the line. A rare moment of solitude. In his satchel were his notes, neatly packed in oilskin to keep them dry. He had begun organizing them in case he didn't make it back, in case someone else found them. He remembered thinking, maybe this is how history survives, not through victories, but through stories told by survivors. Then, it happened. The wind stopped. A stillness fell over the trees. Even the birds were silent. Then, without warning, the air shimmered. It was subtle at first, like heat waves rising off asphalt, but it grew, warping the space ahead of him. The air twisted and pulsed. A strange sound filled the forest, part thunder, part wind, part something entirely unnatural. His legs grew weak. The satchel slipped from his grip, and then the world collapsed inward. Jacob fell. He awoke gasping. Only this time, there was no mud beneath him, no distant rumble of artillery, no stench of blood or decay. He was lying on a sidewalk, modern pavement, smooth and solid. He blinked against the sudden brightness. Overhead, a jet soared across a clear blue sky. Cars rumbled nearby. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. People walked past in jackets and jeans, clutching coffee cups, earbuds in. They barely noticed him. He sat up, trembling. His heart raced. His hands were clean, but still shaking. He looked down. The satchel was still there, resting beside him on the curb, scuffed but intact. Jacob staggered to his feet and turned in circles, trying to take in this impossibility. Neon signs, a billboard advertising a new phone, children laughing, someone yelling into a Bluetooth headset. It was 2025. He was back. When Jacob finally made it home, though it didn't feel like home anymore, he locked the door behind him and collapsed onto the floor, the satchel clutched to his chest. For hours he sat there, shivering under a blanket, listening to the hum of modern life outside his window. No one believed him. Of course they didn't. How could they? When he told his family he had been missing for just a few days, a hiking accident, he claimed, they accepted it. Doctors said he'd suffered from shock, maybe a temporary amnesia, a trauma response. You were dehydrated and hypothermic, one said. It's no wonder you had vivid dreams. He didn't argue, but in the weeks that followed, he couldn't ignore the satchel. He opened it carefully, laying out every page of his journal. His handwriting was still there, but smudged in places by what looked like soot, blood, and tears. There were other items, too: a tin biscuit wrapper, a faded medical band, a German compass with initials scratched into the back. It was real, all of it. Jacob showed the writings to a friend, a professor of modern history. At first, the man was skeptical, but as he read, his expression changed. The letters were too precise. The names matched real soldiers, even obscure ones lost to time. The details about battles, movements, slang, all of it fit, word for word. You either forged this with extraordinary dedication, the historian said, or somehow you've done the impossible. Jacob just smiled. Months later, he published the account under a pseudonym, J.F. Warden. The book was titled, What If You Woke Up in the Middle of World War I? Readers were intrigued. Critics debated its origins. Some hailed it as a powerful anti-war novel, raw and haunting. Others dismissed it as clever fiction. A few fringe theorists believed it could be real. Jacob didn't care. He hadn't written it for them. He had written it for the ones who didn't come back.